All right, AMP1 students, in this video we're going to talk a little bit about some information about the brain and cranial nerves. So we're in chapter 13 now, and I'm going to flip to our learning objectives. So the first objective for chapter 13, we want you to be familiar with some general functions of parts of the brain. And a lot of these parts are ones that you identified in lab. So in this chapter, learning objectives, there is a lot of information in chapter 13, more than we can cover within a week. So what I provided for in the first learning objective is the general functions that you should know for each of these parts of the brain. And again, most of these, majority, you covered or were able to identify in lab. Some of them not so much. I don't think we identified the limbic system. So that's the first objective. And then the second objective, we want to look at the gray and white matter that's located throughout the brain, and it's also located in the spinal cord too. And talk about why the gray matter is gray, why the white matter is white, and what their general functions are. So this is something I think we've talked about before, but we want to formally talk about it. So you can find this information in chapter 13. So we'll talk about they do have pictures showing it looks actually like more of a light brown, but this part here that's darker is representing the gray matter, as well as this part. And then the part that's lighter in color that you can see is representing the white matter. And they also show it in the cerebellum, in the medulla oblongata, and then in the spinal cord too, in those pictures. All right, so I kind of highlighted what you should know for gray matter and white matter distribution and their functions. So the gray matter, the reason that it has that darker or gray color is because, remember, the nervous tissue is primarily made up of neurons and glial cells. Those are the primary cells. And when we're talking about the neurons, remember they have the dendrites, the cell body, and the axons, and then the axon terminals. So when we see a bunch of gray matter within the brain, that is where we have like a cluster of the cell bodies and dendrites of neurons. So that's where they're concentrated, is in the gray matter of the brain. And then the general function then of the gray matter, because we have cell bodies and dendrites, remember those are the cell bodies and dendrites are the receptive end of the neurons. That's where they have chemically gated ion channels, and those will be stimulated to open by certain neurotransmitters. So there's a lot of communication going on in that area, the gray matter, where all those cell bodies and dendrites are. A lot of synapses. So we say that that's the part of the brain tissue where we're getting a lot of the functions of processing, integrating, evaluating, all of that information that's coming from our senses. And so that's the primary role of the gray matter of our brain, is to integrate and process information coming in from the sensory receptors and making decisions based on that. So that is the kind of anatomy of gray matter, and then the general function. And then the white matter, this is where we have more axons associated. So the axon part of the neurons are highly concentrated in these white matter areas of the brain. And the reason that they kind of have more of a white color is because a lot of those axons are covered with myelin sheaths. And we talked about how myelin is a lipid protein compound, and so it's primarily lipid, and lipid is going to have that white color. So if we get a bunch of myelinated axons kind of all bundled together in areas of the brain, we'll get that more white color associated with that tissue. And whenever we we talked about nerves when we have bundles of axons coursing through the peripheral nervous system. We called those nerves. So we had like the phrenic nerve and radial nerve, femoral nerve, sciatic nerve. Those are all nerves in the peripheral nervous system. When we're talking about the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, when we have a bunch of myelinated axons kind of running all together, we don't call them nerves, we call them tracts. So TRACTS. So we call those tracts instead of nerves if they're in the central nervous system. But either way, whether they're in the peripheral nervous system or central nervous system, they'll have kind of that white color because of the high amount of myelinated axons in that area of the brain. And then the general function, since we know that the axon part of our neurons is where the action potentials happen, the long distance communication, that's the primary role of the myelinated axons, or the white matter of the brain, and that's to communicate, relay information from one part of the body or brain to the other. So it's where information gets carried or transmitted along to other areas. So either within the brain and spinal cord or between the brain and the rest of the body. That's the primary role of our white matter. All right, so that is our discussion on gray matter and white matter. So we'll go back to our objectives. Oops, I pulled up the wrong one. There we go. So we're going to talk about the meninges, and we've actually already talked about the meninges as related to their structure and their location. So I won't spend a whole lot of time. I'll kind of show you where you can find that in the chapter, but we covered meninges like twice in Lab 8 and Lab 9 when we were covering the nervous system. So the dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, knowing their structure and location and the various spaces that are found between them, like the subarachnoid space and epidural space and subdural space, is important. So I will show you what's in the book, and then we're going to talk in more detail about meningitis because we didn't actually talk about that in lab. All right, so the cranial meninges. So remember, too, the meninges are there to protect and primarily protect and also support the brain as well as the spinal cord. So their primary role is protection and, of course, support, too, so providing some structure as well.